The London sky was weeping profusely that day, as if sharing in Eleanor's profound grief. She stood before the massive glass windows of the ancient Harrington manor, gazing out at the vast, fog-draped gardens, while the sound of thunder echoed through the mansion's dark corridors. Her father, Lord Arthur Harrington, had died, leaving behind a massive fortune, a vast business empire, and two sisters united only by blood, yet torn apart by greed and avarice. In the classic study, filled with the scent of aged wood and old books, the lawyer, Mr. Brown, sat holding the will. The room was thick with a suffocating silence. On the luxurious leather sofa sat Victoria, the elder sister, wearing an elegant black dress that reflected not a shred of sorrow. Instead, her eyes gleamed with the cold sparkle of victory. Opposite her stood Eleanor, trembling, not from the cold but from the sheer horror of her loss. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read in a monotonous voice, announcing with dry words that the late lord had transferred all his assets, including the manor, the companies, and the bank accounts, to his eldest daughter, Victoria, entrusting her with the full management of the family's affairs. The words caught in Eleanor's throat. Her eyes widened in utter disbelief. Could it be that her father, who considered her the apple of his eye, and who had often confided that he trusted her wisdom far more than her sister's recklessness, had left her with nothing? Victoria smiled a malicious smile and rose slowly, confirming with icy detachment that their father knew who was most worthy of bearing the family name. Eleanor tried to speak, her voice choked with tears, reminding them that her father had told her of other arrangements before his death. But Victoria interrupted her with a voice as sharp as a blade, declaring that documents do not lie, and that the manor was now hers alone. The elder sister was not content merely with seizing the inheritance. She rushed to unleash her deep-seated malice. That very night, as the storm raged outside, she stormed into Eleanor's room and gave her just 1 hour to pack her belongings and leave. Eleanor stared at her in astonishment, wondering about her fate in the midst of this storm, without a single penny, only to receive the glacial reply that this was not her problem, and that the servants were waiting for her to hand over the keys. Less than an hour later, Eleanor found herself standing outside the manor's high iron gates. The rain lashed at her face, and her small suitcase barely shielded her from the howling winds. She looked up at the lit windows, where her sister was celebrating her victory, then turned to face the cold, dark streets of London. She walked for hours through the desolate streets until she found a temporary refuge under the awning of an old bookstore in a narrow alley. She sat on the cold ground and opened her bag to look for a tissue, but her hand struck something solid. She pulled it out slowly. It was a small, ornate wooden box her father had given her in the hospital before taking his last breath, whispering to her not to open it until she thought everything was over. With trembling fingers, she turned the small brass key. Inside the box were neither jewels nor money, but an envelope sealed with red wax bearing a strange crest, an old black key with an intricate design, and a short letter in her father's handwriting that read, "Eleanor, my beloved daughter, if you are reading this, know that Victoria has fallen into the trap. The will read today was merely bait to test her intentions. Go to the address written on the back of the envelope tomorrow at midnight. The real game has not yet begun." Her breath hitched, and the tears of despair in her eyes transformed into a sharp look filled with determination. The storm was still raging through the city, but a new fire had begun to ignite within her. London's pale sun rose over the city's wet streets, waking Eleanor from her short, fitful slumber in the corner of the small cafe she had sought refuge in at dawn. A few coins were all she had left in her coat pockets, but they were enough to buy a cup of black coffee to warm her trembling hands. She sat in the corner, staring at the red envelope and the strange black key, her mind replaying her father's words over and over again. The address written on the back of the envelope pointed to 42 Blackwood Street, an old, forgotten alley in the heart of the capital that no one ever mentioned. The daylight hours passed with a deadly slowness. On the other side of the city, Victoria was living the ecstasy of absolute victory. She had fired the senior servants who had shown loyalty to Eleanor and began rearranging the luxurious manor to suit her arrogant taste. That afternoon, she held an urgent meeting with the lawyer Brown and a group of foreign investors, planning to sell the historic shares of the Harrington Company to liquidate her wealth as quickly as possible, unaware that the ground she stood on was not as solid as she imagined. When Big Ben struck, announcing the approach of midnight, Eleanor was standing in front of building number 42. The street was drowned in thick London fog, illuminated by dim gas lamps that cast long, eerie shadows on the stone walls. The building looked like an abandoned watchmaker's shop. Its wooden facade was rotting, and its windows were covered in dust. With a pounding heart, she took out the black key and inserted it into the rusty brass lock. To her surprise, the key turned perfectly smoothly, as if the lock had been freshly oiled. She pushed the door open and stepped into a dark hallway. No sooner had she taken her first step than warm wall sconces lit up automatically, revealing an elegant spiral staircase leading to an underground vault. She descended the stairs cautiously, finding herself in a lavish, immaculately tidy library that smelled of fine cigars and antique paper. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat an elderly man with sharp features and thick prescription glasses, wearing a classic English suit. "I have been expecting you, Miss Harrington," the man said in a calm, deep voice, rising slowly to greet her. Eleanor took a step back, asking fearfully, "Who are you, and what is this place?" He gestured for her to sit in the opposite chair and replied, "I am Mr. Stirling, Lord Arthur's private attorney and the keeper of his secrets. What you witnessed yesterday with Mr. Brown was merely a play masterfully directed by your father. Brown is a man easily bought, and your father knew that Victoria would pay him to alter the will to suit her greed." Eleanor's eyes widened in astonishment as Stirling continued, opening a small iron safe on his desk. The true Harrington family fortune, the manor, the global accounts, and even the brand name were never registered directly in your father's name. Rather, they belonged to a secret trust fund not subject to the usual laws of inheritance. The will read yesterday grants Victoria nothing but phantom assets and an empty shell of the empire. Mr. Stirling placed a black leather folder in front of Eleanor and opened it to reveal official documents bearing supreme government seals. "There is a hidden clause in the trust's charter," Stirling added, looking directly into her eyes. "If Victoria attempts to sell or liquidate any of the phantom assets, the clause is automatically triggered, and she is stripped of everything, including her right to bear the family name. But, for the trap to be complete and the true empire to pass to the rightful heir, chosen by Lord Arthur for her wisdom and kind heart, you must sign these papers tonight." Eleanor grasped the golden pen he offered her. She felt the weight of responsibility and a hidden power coursing through her veins. These were not just papers. They were the deeds to restore her father's honor and a quiet revenge against the sister who had mercilessly thrown her into the cold streets of London. She signed her name with a steady hand. Mr. Stirling gave her a proud smile and said, "Tomorrow at 10 in the morning, Victoria will hold a meeting to sign the company's sale contracts. I believe it is time for the true Harrington heir to return to her manor and put an end to this farce." The following morning, the thick fog that had long enveloped the streets of London lifted, leaving behind a cold, clear blue sky, as if the city itself had washed away the sins of the previous night and was preparing for the dawn of a new era. Inside Mr. Stirling's vault, Eleanor had not slept for a single minute. The hours passed as she studied the documents, understanding every detail of the true empire her father had built in the shadows, far from prying eyes and family greed. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Stirling served her a cup of fine English tea and pointed to an elegant black box placed on a velvet sofa. The box contained a meticulously tailored, classic women's suit in a dark, almost black gray, and a long coat of luxurious wool. "Lord Arthur left clear instructions for everything, even your appearance on the day of your return," the old lawyer said with a dignified smile. When Eleanor wore those clothes and looked at herself in the tall mirror, she did not see the broken girl who had been cast out into the storm 2 nights prior. Instead, she saw the heir of the Harrington family, with features cloaked in a noble coldness and eyes blazing with sharp intelligence and unyielding determination. Meanwhile, inside the walls of Harrington Manor, the atmosphere was bustling and filled with the vanity of victory. In the grand meeting room, with its oak-paneled walls adorned with oil paintings of the family's ancestors, Victoria sat at the head of the massive oval table. She wore a glaring red dress, reflecting her desire to draw attention and assert her absolute dominance. Beside her stood the lawyer, Brown, rubbing his hands with a nervousness mixed with obvious greed, while three senior foreign investors lined up on the other side, their eyes gleaming as they reviewed the acquisition papers for the historic Harrington Company's assets. "Gentlemen," Victoria said in a condescending tone as she sipped from a crystal glass, "by signing these contracts today, we will have turned the page on my father's old and tedious past to begin a new era of cash liquidity and rapid investments. The manor, the factories, and the shares all will transfer to your management in exchange for the agreed sum, which will be transferred to my private account in Switzerland immediately." The lead investor smiled and pulled a golden pen from his pocket, saying with a heavy foreign accent, "It is our pleasure to do business with a decisive businesswoman like yourself, Miss Harrington." Lawyer Brown leaned in to arrange the papers before her, his heart pounding in anticipation of his massive commission. Victoria picked up the pen and cast one last look of sheer vanity at her father's portrait hanging above the fireplace, as if challenging him in his grave. She lowered the pen's nib toward the paper and was about to write the first letter of her name, had it not been for the resounding noise that shattered the silence of the luxurious room. The double doors of the meeting room were thrown open with force and violence, crashing against the wooden walls with a sound like a thunderclap. Hands froze, and all eyes turned toward the door. There in the doorframe stood Eleanor, towering like a statue, flanked by Mr. Stirling, and four men in black suits bearing official federal badges. A dead silence prevailed for a few moments before Victoria leaped to her feet, her face colored with rage, and screamed in a sharp voice, "What is the meaning of this nonsense? How dare you enter my manor? Didn't I throw you out into the street, you beggar? Guards! Where are the guards?" Eleanor stepped slowly and with provocative calmness toward the table, the sound of her steady footsteps echoing in the room like the ticking of a death clock. She stopped a few paces from her sister and looked at her with an icy stare devoid of any emotion. "Your manor?" Eleanor asked in a low voice, yet sharp as a blade. "I believe you need to review your papers again, Victoria." "Lawyer," Brown stammered and took a step forward, trying to control the situation. "Miss Eleanor, this is an illegal intrusion. These properties belong to Miss Victoria under Lord Arthur's notarized will. I will call the police immediately." "We have saved you the trouble, Mr. Brown," Mr. Stirling interrupted, stepping forward and placing his leather briefcase heavily onto the table. "The police are already waiting outside, but not to arrest Miss Eleanor, rather to arrest you on charges of forging official documents and breach of trust." Brown's face turned pale, and he took 2 steps back, while Victoria's eyes widened in confusion. "What forgery are you talking about, you senile old man? He read the will himself, and my father signed it." Stirling pulled a black file from his briefcase and threw it into the middle of the table. "The will in your hands is indeed a genuine document, and it bears Lord Arthur's signature. But it is not worth the ink it was written with. Lord Arthur, with his usual genius, transferred the ownership of all his assets, his wealth, his companies, and this very manor into a closed international trust fund a full year before his death. What he left in the supposed will was nothing but shell companies and an empty husk carrying the family's brand name." The investors exchanged worried glances and stopped holding their pens. Victoria screamed, beginning to lose her temper. "This is a lie. This is a cheap trick to rob me. The bank accounts were full of money yesterday." "They were frozen funds subject to the trust fund's law," Eleanor clarified, taking an extra step to face her sister face to face. "My father placed a single secret clause in the trust document called the downfall clause. This clause states that should the temporary heir, which is you, attempt to liquidate the assets or sell the family company to foreign entities out of greed, the clause is automatically triggered. The moment you sat in this chair today with the intent to sign, you were stripped of everything." Stirling took out an official document stamped with the Supreme Court's seal. "By virtue of this clause, which was activated this morning when you issued the sale order to the investors. All properties devolve immediately and exclusively to the backup and rightful heir, Miss Eleanor Harrington. Not only that, Victoria, but your attempt to sell assets you do not actually own is considered first-degree commercial fraud, and the accumulated taxes on those shell companies you inherited have now fallen on your shoulders personally. You do not only not own the manor, but you are in debt for millions of pounds that lifetimes upon lifetimes would not be enough to pay off. The words fell like a devastating thunderbolt upon the hall. The foreign investors rose quickly and gathered their papers in anger. One of them turned to Victoria and spat his words. "You almost implicated us in an international fraud scandal. We will contact our lawyers and we will sue you for wasting our time and attempted scam." They left the hall hurriedly, followed by 2 federal investigators. Within seconds, everything collapsed. Victoria looked left and right, searching for a way out. She looked at Brown and found him trembling as 2 officers advanced towards him to put handcuffs on his wrists amidst his panicked screams and desperate attempts to justify his position by claiming he was only following orders. Victoria's knees gave way and she collapsed onto the luxurious leather chair, her hands shaking. She looked at Eleanor, all traces of arrogance having vanished from her face, replaced by genuine terror and tears of defeat. "Eleanor, please," she whispered in a broken voice filled with humiliation. "We are sisters. The same blood flows in our veins. You cannot do this to me. You cannot leave me to prison and debts." Eleanor looked at her for a long time. She remembered last night, the cold rain that lashed her face, the darkness, the terror, and the cruel words with which she was expelled without a shred of mercy. She remembered how greed had blinded her sister even to the simplest meanings of humanity. "The same blood?" Eleanor said with a terrifying calmness. "Where was this blood last night when you threw me to the dogs in the storm? My father gave you a chance to be a leader for this family, but you chose to destroy his legacy for a handful of money. This was not my trap, Victoria. This was your trap, and you walked into it of your own free will." Eleanor motioned to the security men at the door. "You have 5 minutes to get out of my manor. Take only your clothes. You will not need much where you're going." Victoria's hysterical screams escalated as she was dragged out of the hall, cursing her luck and the day she was born, while the echo of her voice gradually faded in the wide corridors of the manor, allowing the majestic silence to wrap the place once again. Eleanor was left alone in the meeting room with Mr. Stirling. She approached slowly to the massive glass window she had stood before yesterday, crying bitterly. She looked at the vast gardens. The rain had stopped, and the sun's rays began to peek through the clouds to illuminate wide green spaces, reflecting on the marble fountains with a gleam of hope. "Lord Arthur was a wise man," said Stirling, standing at a respectful distance behind her. "He knew that true power is not inherited through papers but forged in adversity. Today you have proven that you are worthy of the Harrington name." Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of mountains lifting from her chest. She had reclaimed her life, her father's legacy, and was done with her family's poison forever. She turned toward the massive table and pulled out the main chair to sit on it. She placed her hands on the cold wood and raised her head proudly, ready to write the first chapter of her own empire. And at that moment, the manor was not merely stone and furniture, but a living witness that justice, no matter how delayed, always has its harsh and perfect way of restoring balance, and that whoever digs a pit of greed will inevitably be buried in it in a single night. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to receive all the latest fun and exciting stories.